Hello, my name is Robin. This is a video of the painting process for my really big wind turbine. Um, so all the footage is in 2 times speed, just so we can get through it. There were some big chunks missing because I couldn't get it to record properly, or the light was bad, or I just forgot, that sort of thing. So let's jump right into it. You can see here that my little sketchbook there has got lots of different colour mixes that I'd made up, where I was testing out some different greens and browns, colours that would be good for the landscape, and just figuring out which colour mixes, which paints and pigments I would need to go into there. And just at the top of the screen there is my palette, which is just a dish I got from a charity shop, but it works really well for this when you need quite large quantities of paint. And I am just mixing up my first colour. So I wanted to start off with a very soft yellow. This is using Naples yellow from Core, that's Qor, which is a really good professional quality watercolour. And they're also a vegan brand, which is good for me. So I'm just mixing up some of those initial colours that I was going to want. Some sap green also on the palette there, which is on its own a very strong colour, but toned down with the yellows and browns and things, it becomes much more natural. So I have already sketched out using a fountain pen and ink, a Noodler's Creeper and Diatramentis Document Black. Has already been sketched out on the paper, so that I'm ready to go. That's after doing a few different thumbnail sketches and practice sketches and so on and so forth. And a large part of the process of doing any painting, I find, but particularly something of this scale, is just mixing up paint. I find it quite difficult to judge the correct quantity of paint that I need, so I'm not always great at mixing up enough paint. So here you can see I'm using a very thinned down, very transparent wash of the yellow, which I'm going to put all over the hillside part of this drawing. I started off using this huge, very soft sword brush, but it's actually a little bit too floppy to just get in a neat wash, because I just want this to be a very flat wash. So I then went back in with a 1-inch flat brush, and just started putting in this very transparent pale yellow all over. And the reason for this is it helps to give a nice cohesive tone to the painting. I wanted to get across a nice golden summery glow to the whole thing, and this was being done sort of in the middle of summer. As you know, in the UK this year we've had an unusually long period of very hot, dry weather over the summer, and I think that was kind of in my mind as I was doing this, and getting that nice warm glow, or nice soft glow, I think, rather than warm, is just creates a nice look, or at least it does in my mind. So as I say, said before, I struggle to mix up sufficient quantities of paint, so I'm going back in there, mixing up more paint, watering it down sufficiently, and putting it back onto the paper. The paper I'm using here is a Fabriano Artistico hot press paper, in a full imperial size, so that's 30 by 22 inches. And yeah, as you can see, the lighting has shifted here. I was quite often working of an evening, so the lighting did shift as we went along. but it's just a case of getting this wash down. I wasn't worried about it being perfect because I knew that I was going to have lots of different layers going over the top of this, but I did want a fairly even tone across it all. I'm also not going for a super precise, crisp, clean, photorealistic painting. That's not, I would say it's not my style. It's mostly just I don't have the patience for that, or I don't have the patience to learn how to do that. So instead I like to do some things which are a bit bolder and a bit looser, and claim that that's my style. And I think that works. I think that I get away with that quite nicely. The occasional bouncing that you're seeing there is because I had this, I think at this point the camera was on a tiny little grippy tripod thing which was attached to a large wooden staff which was leaning against a chair next to the table, so it wasn't the most secure of filming setups, so every so often I would nudge it and it just knocked everything. Okay, so here we're on to mixing up the first set of greens. So I've started with that pool of Naples yellow, and I'm adding some indigo into that, also from Core. And I found that the indigo is a beautiful blue colour, but with the Naples yellow you get these really nice mossy greens. Now obviously we've skipped forward quite a bit here in the footage, which is a shame. It's just, I'd like to say, I could have sworn I'd recorded earlier, but apparently not. So we've got all the green in here, but you can still see the process because it was repeating this process over and over using different shades of green. And at this point I am using that sword brush because I like how soft it is. I like having the very fine point, but also then being able to do much broader strokes with it, and that allows me to put in these really choppy, very directional lines, and I just like the feeling that gives to the whole thing. It makes it feel quite energetic and alive to me, a little bit wilder, a little bit more abstract, and it helps to sort of hide the fact that I'm not very good at detail work, and instead we can pretend that it's entirely made to be a slapdash sort of looking painting. So just using different shades of greens which have mixed up. This hill in particular used a lot of that indigo and Naples yellow mix because it gives this sort of bluish green, which is beautiful. In the foreground there's a mix of the brighter green. In the middle is sap green and Naples yellow, and then we've also got phthalo blue and deep yellow, making some beautiful mixes there. So it's just a case of going in with repeated layers, sometimes going in with the same colour again just to deepen things up, but quite often going in with very slightly different mixes, so perhaps adding a little bit more blue or a bit more green or a bit more yellow to try and alter the tone, and this is similar, I guess you could call it a type of glazing. Glazing is normally a much more even process. You would put much more even layers over rather than this sort of slapdash technique, but it is still the idea of building up a final colour by putting very thin layers of different hues on top of each other. So sometimes going in with a more yellow mix if I want to get back that more golden glow, sometimes going in with a bit more blue if I want to deepen it, and the greens and things to brighten the whole thing up, and just playing around with the saturation and the tone in order to try and get some feeling of depth and of the layers of these hills and the hillside that's going on here. And that meant going backwards and forwards 3 different sections quite a lot in order to allow one layer to dry, and then I could go back to the next layer. I think also in this image you can just make out I've put a very, very light thin wash of a blue in the sky area there, and I believe that was, I want to say that's a very watered down indigo. It's possible it was the phthalo blue, but I think it's the very watered down indigo, just to get some tone on there, because I was struggling to get the tones and the hues of the hillsides and the countryside sort of areas correct with nothing in the sky to balance it out. It was making it a little bit intimidating at times. So a little bit about why I'm doing the painting here. Oh, one case we just missed. No, we're moving on to another section. Okay, I'll get back to why of the painting in a minute. So what I'm doing here is just covering up the hillside areas because I want to protect them. What you can't see on here, you can just about make out water appearing on that sky area. I was using a spray bottle to get a lot of water on the sky area. I wanted to do a very, very wet wash to get the type of effect I needed. So that meant putting down a lot of water, and it was easiest to do that using a spray bottle. So I needed to protect the rest of the painting, so I didn't saturate that as well. And now I'm going in here with a smaller brush. This is an oval brush, or I think sometimes called a cat's tongue. And I've got here a mixture of indigo and Payne's grey, and I am using a technique from I learnt in a Skillshare class because I wasn't very confident with doing sky. It's not something I've done much before, and I knew I wanted to create these really nice soft atmospheric clouds which are typical even in a dry period of British summers. So I looked on Skillshare for different sky watercolour sky techniques and found one dedicated to creating clouds, and I'll put a link to that in the description because it's really good. So the technique involves having this very, very wet paper and then going in with a fairly dark mixture and using a very loose hand, swinging back and forth, creating these sort of half circle shapes and loose cloud shapes. If it was on dry paper, and as it goes down on the paper quite hard, it looks awful. It looks really unrealistic and looks like some really harsh lines and, you know, just scribbling on the paper there. But because of the amount of water that's down, it very quickly starts to disperse. The pigment starts to disperse, so you get this nice soft effect with just the hint of those shapes remaining in there. And by altering the colour that you're picking up every so often, so sometimes using a bit more blue, sometimes using a bit more of the grey, you can get this really nice layered effect with some areas darker, and it gives it a lot of dimension. So it's just going backwards and forwards with that, taking care to make sure that going around the sorry about that, that's just a notification on my laptop. Taking care that in going around the turbines themselves, I make sure to match up the intensity of colour on either side of those blades, because otherwise it would look very disjointed. but it's a bit tricky to obviously do this very loose freehand technique whilst trying to preserve the edges. So that's why I used a smaller brush in some areas, and then you'll see me going in sometimes with this small flat brush and with the tissue. So every so often some of the pigment spills over onto the turbine blades, which at this point I'm trying to keep white. So I'm just using the tissue to dab off any pigment which has settled there. And you'll see me in a few moments as well using the small flat brush, which has just got clean water on, and just sort of scrubbing at areas which have got pigment on which I wanted to remain white, and that helps to lift the pigment, and then I can dab it off using the tissue. So just going back in, darkening areas up, letting it soften, moving on to the next area, trying to match the intensity and the colour there, and then just going backwards and forwards, trying not to overwork it because you don't want to lose that sort of depth. You want some looseness to it, and if you go over it too many times you just end up with a very flat area of colour, which just it's not very inspiring. I mean, it sometimes does reflect what a British sky is like, but not in this case. And you can see sometimes as well I'm just smoothing out water to make sure that the paper is staying as wet as I need it to, and hasn't started to dry out in between. So yes, I was talking about why this painting. So I really like wind turbines. That's sort of the big thing. I really like wind turbines. I think they're majestic and elegant and beautiful. Plus they're renewable energy, and that's good, and we should have more of that. So I really like them. I think they're a nice part of the British landscape. I think they're a nice part of a modern British landscape, and it's good to reflect that. So I'm also really into something called solarpunk, which is it's kind of a sci-fi offshoot, and it's rather than being a dystopian future where everything is terrible, it focuses much more instead on living in a future world which is harmonious with nature, which is very eco-friendly, which is very accessible and sensitive to the people who live in it and the environment around us. And a lot of the time solarpunk art can look very sci-fi and has similar themes. It's very similar themes running through it, but understandably with a name like solarpunk, it often is set in places which are very bright and sunny, which the UK isn't. So in a more realistic solarpunk setting, you have to think that if we want everybody to live in this sort of harmonious way, we have to consider the different places that people live and the different landscapes we live in. And that includes places like the UK, which has got hills, doesn't have an awful lot of sun, at least not consistently, does have an awful lot of wind and other exciting weather. And that means that for us, we are actually starting to see hints of that solarpunk future. Now that's not to say that I think we're ever going to reach that sort of utopian ideal, but I do think we can see some hope there in the fact that we have got wind turbines, we have got them as a growing part of our landscape, and they can be beautiful and they can be elegant and they can be pleasing. So I quite like the idea of painting solarpunk scenes which are almost very mundane and very gentle. So to my mind, this is both a contemporary British landscape, but it is also a futuristic solarpunk landscape. And I think seeing that the two things can be the same thing is actually really good, because it means that things like solarpunk ideals, the idea of harmonious utopias where we are eco-friendly and we live in harmony with the world around us and with each other, they don't have to seem as far-fetched and as out of reach as you might first think, if you consider that we already live in a world where we have landscapes like this, and I think that's really awesome. So back to the painting. You can see I've finished the sky, that's dried, and I've moved on to the turbines themselves. Leaving them bright white just wouldn't have worked because that's not how light and shadows work. So I'm going in with this 1/2 inch flat brush, and at this point I'm using, I believe, just Payne's grey, and just sort of filling in the basic shapes of shadows, and where the light hits, the light and dark spots, and just taking time to think about where the light would be hitting, where the shadows would be falling. That can be a little tricky with wind turbines because of the shape of the blades, and that the blades are very dimensional and can move. They often move with some independence per turbine. So they might not always be oriented in the way you expect them to be, which means that you might not always be getting the shadows on them that you would expect. So trying to convey that complex 3D shape of the turbine blades, and how they work, and not make it look like I'm just really bad at drawing 3D objects. Like, I'm not brilliant at it, but I'm not as terrible as you might think at this point looking at the different shapes. So just filling in those shadows really starts to help bring it all together and make the shapes make sense. I've just switched to my... Ooh, which one is this? It's my 1/4 inch dagger? 1/4 inch dagger. Which again is another of my... It's probably my favourite brush. It's so versatile because you can use it as a flat brush, you can use it as a liner brush. The tip allows you to do some really fine detail. It's a really nice brush. Again, I'll put a link in the description as to the one I'm using, just so you can see. Now, at some point, I'm not sure if I have yet here because I can't see the palette, unfortunately. As I say, I started out with Payne's grey. Now, the Payne's grey I'm using is actually from a very old W.H. Smith watercolour set. So it's, for the price of it, for a complete set of watercolours at that price, it's actually pretty decent paint. I've actually had these paints for 15 years and they still work really well out of the tube. They re-wet really well if you leave them to dry. You actually get some nice mixes and some fairly good strength of pigment from them, but they're not always perfect. They're not always quite as good as professional grade paints, and one of the issues I have is with the Payne's grey. Now, Payne's grey is made up of blue pigments, that's how it is across the board, but for some reason this particular Payne's grey I have separates out really quickly, and I found that as I was doing this, I was actually getting, rather than some nice soft grey shadows, I was getting a fairly bright blue cast on it, which just wasn't quite what I wanted. I really wanted more of a grey. So possibly here, while you can't see what I'm doing, is I'm actually mixing up a grey myself. So I will have used a mixture of indigo for that blue tone, a burnt sienna and Venetian red, I believe, to get a nice inky dark grey, which then when watered down, it still has some of that soft coolness to it that you get from the indigo in it, but it doesn't, this mix doesn't seem to separate out quite as readily as the pre-mixed Payne's grey. So, I mean, that's one of the pros and cons of using pre-mixed colours and multi-pigment colours is that sometimes they might behave in a way which is a little bit peculiar. Though of course they are convenient and sometimes they're exactly what you need. But it does mean that having single pigment paints or paints with multiple pigments, but that you're more confident with how they behave, so you can mix your own colours, you get a little bit more control over what you're actually putting down on the paper. So after just cleaning up a couple of areas there where there had been some spillover from the sky, I can continue with filling in the shadows and edges of the turbines. So just using that smaller dagger brush just to do some of the slightly finer details and to be able to get into the points right at the centre there, and using progressively darker mixes or darker washes of the grey and to start to darken up those shadows and give a bit more dimension and depth to the whole thing. I have got some reference photos open on my laptop, which is just off screen there, and they are by a photographer called Keith Arkins, who is a renewable energy and industrial photographer who I follow on Instagram, and I will post a link to his Instagram account in the description as well. He's got some beautiful photographs of wind turbines, and even though I'm not copying exactly any of those, I did use a lot of them as reference just to start to get the shadows and shape and orientation of everything looking right. And they're beautiful photographs. I enjoy them because I like the subject matter a lot, but I think a lot of people could get enjoyment out of them. I kind of like as well that there is you can make a niche profession out of being a wind turbine photographer. It's quite cool. So I'm just using progressively darker mixes of the grey, particularly for this more distant wind turbine. Obviously, as it's further away, we tend not to actually see much of the white on it at all. We just get a silhouetted, shadowed effect. It's kind of interesting. It's almost tempting to leave it white because our brain tells us that it is a wind turbine and the wind turbines are white, the other wind turbines are white. So we make adjustments when we see it in real life. We see the shadows, but we interpret those as shadows on white. So it would be easy to forget that and to just try and leave it white or very, very light indeed. So it's a case of just repeatedly going back in with the darker colours just to darken it up so that we're actually getting what you see as opposed to what we think should be there. I'm using some of that darker grey just to put in some texture along here, which is a river. It's supposed to be a river. It's not actually the best looking river. I could have done with some more references, I think, to get this looking right. But the idea is that it is a river cutting through a valley there. So just going with some greys, with the grey mix and with Payne's grey, because a little bit of bluish in this isn't too bad. Again, when we look at rivers in valleys and in natural settings, we know it's clear water, but what we actually often see are dark greys and lots of shadows with glints here and there. And then using some of the green mixes mixed with some of those greys just to go in and darken up those certain aspects of this hillside and those areas which are further away, more shadowed. Just taking time to put them in and to create that depth and those different textures. Now unfortunately it's just off the right of the screen here, you can't actually see much of what I'm doing. Just peeks onto the screen. I'm just going across with that darker greyish mixture with a little bit of burnt sienna mixed into it, and the edge of the dagger brush. Like I say, it's a really versatile brush because you can create some beautiful shapes with it. And just going in, I was creating a sort of vague wall type effect along the bottom, which dips out of frame, and then just putting some shadow in along the at the bottom of the turbines, just to help seat them a little bit better into the ground, since I haven't gone and put in the actual base plates that they really have. And then just using some of the darker greens and greys just to put in a little bit more texture and a bit more interest into these hill areas, just creating some shadowed areas, changes of depth and direction. The vague idea of edges is quite important, and sort of here as well, just putting in that slight wall type feature going across near the bottom of the painting, just using the edge of the brush to create those sort of blockish linear shapes. Gives the vague impression of dry stone wall without actually painting a dry stone wall, which then fits in with the really loose brush strokes of the rest of the landscape around there. And it was just small details like this which I didn't have necessarily planned out to begin with, but it's what kind of brought the whole thing together for me. So they were quite good to do. Just the odd dots here and there, and here is the finished piece after it is dried, and I am really pleased with how it turned out. I like the size and the scale of the turbines, but how it's still quite soft, and has a gentleness to it, a peacefulness to it, which sort of gets across the serenity I feel when we see these in our landscape. I have got plans for future paintings on a similar topic. I've just bought more paper so that I can do some more of these nice large scale paintings. I would like to do a couple more of wind turbines and possibly one or two more which start to push the sci-fi feeling into more solarpunk realms, but still within this sort of very British countryside landscape. Okay, so that's this painting done with. It's been really interesting to talk through it a little bit after I finished painting it. I hope you found it interesting and liked seeing it happen. If you would like to see more of my paintings, you can follow me on Instagram at Spoony Skeleton, though there is a mixture of content on that feed, including chronic illness stuff, horse riding, as well as art. But thank you very much.